Something is happening to you right now, and you cannot ignore it anymore. Because the fact that you are here, reading these words at this exact moment, is not random. There is a reason this message reached you. Not because you searched for it, but because something inside you is finally ready to wake up, and for a long time, you were made to believe the opposite of who you truly are. Stay with me. Because what you are about to hear will not just inspire you, it will rewire the way you see yourself. You were never weak, but someone, somewhere, taught you to think like you are, and that belief quietly became your identity. Let that sink in, because this is where everything begins to change. You are not weak, you were taught to think you are. Say it in your mind right now, slowly. Feel it resisting in your body. That resistance is not truth. That resistance is conditioning breaking. You are not weak, you were taught to think you are. For years, you absorbed invisible instructions, words you were told, silences you were forced to accept, moments where you should have spoken, but didn't, and every time you stayed quiet, a false version of you grew stronger. Not the real you, but the trained you, the controlled you, the version shaped by fear, comparison, rejection, and repetition. But here is what nobody tells you. Identity is not discovered, it is installed, and anything installed can be rewritten. You are not weak, you were taught to think you are, and if it was taught, it can be untaught. Now listen carefully. There is a spiritual law at work here, the law of repetition and identity formation. Whatever you repeat under emotional pressure becomes your subconscious truth. Not what is correct, but what is repeated. Not what is real, but what is felt often enough to become reality. That is why your thoughts feel automatic. That is why your doubt feels natural. That is why your fear feels like you. But it is not you, it is programming. You are not weak, you were taught to think you are. Stay with this moment, because this is where most people break. But a few people awaken. There was a man once. He was not born afraid. He was not born silent. But life did something subtle to him. Every time he spoke up, he was dismissed. Every time he tried, he was corrected. Every time he believed, he was laughed at. Until one day, he stopped trying. Not because he lost strength, but because he lost permission in his own mind. Years later, when he was finally alone, he realized something terrifying. Nobody was holding him back anymore, but he was still not moving. That is when he understood. The prison was never external. It was internalized. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. And maybe that man is not someone from history. Maybe it is a reflection of you. But here is where the shift begins. Because there is a hidden truth buried beneath all of this. Weakness is not your nature. It is a learned response to repeated emotional suppression. When expression is punished, silence becomes safety. When failure is shamed, fear becomes strategy. When truth is ignored, self-doubt becomes identity. And over time, you stop reacting to life and start shrinking within it. But shrinking is not your destiny. Expansion is. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Say it again, not as hope, but as correction. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Now feel this shift. Something inside you is beginning to separate. The real you from the conditioned you. And this separation is sacred, because the moment you see the difference, you are no longer fully controlled by it. There is a reason you feel exhausted lately. Not because life is too heavy, but because you are constantly carrying an identity that is not yours. You are fighting battles built by old programming, and every battle you fight from false identity drains your energy. But when truth enters, energy returns, clarity returns, power returns. Because alignment is not about becoming something new. It is about removing what you are not. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Now listen closely. This is the turning point. There is a spiritual principle called the return to original frequency. It means this. Before conditioning, there is clarity. Before fear, there is confidence. Before doubt, there is stillness. Your original self is not broken, it is buried, and everything you call weakness is simply disconnection from that original state. Stay with me, because now we go deeper. You were never meant to shrink in the presence of life. You were meant to respond to it, not with fear, but with authority, not with hesitation, but with alignment. But the world does not always teach that. It teaches comparison, it teaches silence, it teaches survival instead of expression. And slowly, you forget your own voice, but your voice never disappeared. It is still there, waiting under layers of doubt. And the moment you speak it again, everything changes. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Now let that statement move through you differently, not as words, but as a release. Because something inside you is letting go. And here is the hidden truth. Most people do not lack strength. They lack permission. Permission to act. Permission to fail. Permission to be seen. Permission to exist without apology. But permission was never something you were meant to wait for. It is something you were meant to claim. And this is where transformation begins. Because the moment you stop asking the world who you are and start declaring it yourself, reality begins to reorganize around you. Now listen, this is not metaphor. This is psychological and spiritual alignment merging as one force. Your subconscious does not respond to truth. It responds to repetition with emotion. So whatever you repeatedly declare with feeling becomes structure, becomes behavior, becomes destiny. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Now breathe that in, because we are about to shift everything. There is a final stage, the breaking of identity illusion. It feels uncomfortable, because the mind resists losing its familiar story, even when the story is limiting. It feels safe. But you are not here for safety anymore. You are here for truth, and truth does not always feel gentle at first. It feels like exposure. It feels like waking up in a room you never knew you were trapped in. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And that is your power. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Now repeat it again, but this time, not as affirmation, but as declaration. Because something in you is no longer asking permission, it is remembering authority. And here is your challenge. For the next 3 days, every time fear rises, do not obey it immediately. Pause and say this line out loud. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Not once, not silently, but deliberately. Because each repetition is not just words. It is reprogramming. It is interruption. It is reclaiming. And slowly, the old identity loses grip. Now we reach the final revelation. The world never defined your strength. It only reflected your doubt back to you, and you accepted the reflection as truth. But reflections are not identity. They are feedback. And feedback can be changed. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Say it one last time. Let it land fully now. Because this is no longer about motivation. This is about return. Return to clarity. Return to presence. Return to power that was never lost, only forgotten. And now, you stand at the edge of something different. Not a new version of you, but the original one. Unfiltered, unconditioned, unshaken. And from this moment forward, you do not ask the world who you are. You declare it. Final truth. You were never weak. You were only taught to forget your strength, and now you remember. Comment below. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Something is happening to you even after hearing all of this, because part of you is still wondering, can this really be true for me? Stay with me, because that question is exactly where transformation begins. Doubt is not your enemy. Doubt is the echo of old programming trying to survive inside new awareness. And right now, that old version of you is panicking quietly because it knows something is changing. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Feel that line again, not as repetition, but as collision. Two identities cannot exist peacefully in the same mind. One must dissolve, and the one dissolving right now is the false one. Let that sink in. Because what you call personality, what you call your nature, what you call just how I am, is often just repeated emotional conditioning that never got questioned. But here is what nobody prepared you for. Awakening does not feel like light at first. It feels like loss of the old explanations, loss of automatic thoughts, loss of the identity that kept you small but safe. And safety is seductive. Even when it is limiting you, you are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Say it again, slowly. Because repetition is not redundancy. It is dismantling. There is a moment in every human life where they realize something terrifying. They have been reacting, not choosing. They have been surviving, not living. They have been echoing, not expressing. And that realization breaks something open, not to destroy you, but to reveal you. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Now listen carefully, because this goes deeper than motivation. There is a hidden system running your inner world. It is built from emotional memory loops. Every humiliation you never processed, every rejection you never questioned, every moment you decided, I cannot, instead of I will try again. All of it formed invisible pathways in your mind, and your mind always chooses the strongest pathway, not the truest one, the strongest one. That is why change feels difficult. Not because you are incapable, but because repetition has weight. But here is the truth that shifts everything. What was learned can be unlearned. What was automatic can be interrupted. What was identity can be rewritten. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. And every time you speak that truth, you weaken the illusion. Now something subtle is happening inside you. You are starting to observe yourself instead of becoming yourself. That separation is powerful, because awareness is the first fracture in conditioning. Before change happens outside, it must first happen as observation inside. Stay with this, because this is where most people miss the shift. They try to fight their thoughts, but thoughts are not the enemy. Identification is. The moment you stop saying, I am weak, and start saying, I notice a thought that tells me I am weak, everything begins to collapse. Because now, you are no longer inside the program. You are watching it. And what you can watch, you can no longer fully obey. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Now the repetition is no longer affirmation. It is separation. It is distance. It is freedom forming in real time. There is another truth you must face now. Your environment did not just shape your habits, it shaped your expectations. If you were constantly around doubt, you learned hesitation. If you were constantly around criticism, you learned self-editing. If you were constantly around limitation, you learned shrinking. And over time, you stopped noticing that you were living inside borrowed beliefs. But borrowed beliefs have expiration dates. And yours is now arriving. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Say it again, because this is the moment where identity begins to crack. Not violently, but silently. Like old paint peeling from a wall that was never truly yours. Now listen closely. There is a spiritual law working through all of this. The law of inner agreement. Whatever you repeatedly agree with internally, even if it is false, becomes operational reality. That means you did not become weak because you were weak. You became weak because you agreed with weakness long enough for it to feel like truth. But agreement can be withdrawn. And the moment you withdraw agreement, the structure collapses. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Now we go deeper again, because there is a stage beyond awareness. It is resistance. This is where the mind will fight back. It will say, this is just motivation. This will not last. This is not me. And you must observe that too, without obeying it. Because resistance is not proof of failure, it is proof of rewiring. Every old identity resists extinction, even false ones, especially false ones. But you are not here to preserve the old self. You are here to remember the original one. And the original self does not beg for permission. It recognizes truth instantly. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Now feel something shift, not outside, inside. A quiet space opening, where reaction used to be. Now there is observation. Where fear used to take over. Now there is distance. Where identity used to tighten. Now there is space. That space is you returning. And here is what that space begins to do. It allows new choices. Not forced choices. Conscious ones. You pause longer before reacting. You question thoughts before believing them. You breathe before assuming defeat. And in that pause, everything changes. Because your life is not controlled by what happens to you. It is controlled by what you accept instantly. Now listen. This is your turning point. For so long, you waited to feel strong before acting strong. But strength is not a feeling first. It is a decision first. A quiet refusal to continue identifying with limitation. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Now I want you to feel this differently. Not as a phrase, but as a boundary. Something ends here, and something begins here. The repetition now is not just spiritual, it is structural. It is rebuilding the architecture of your self-image. And finally, here is your deeper challenge. For the next 7 days, whenever you catch yourself shrinking, in conversation, in thought, in hesitation, do not judge it, just interrupt it. And speak this line internally or aloud. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. And then do one small action you would normally avoid. Because identity does not change through insight alone. It changes through interruption followed by action. Now we reach the final unfolding. You will notice something strange happening. The voice that once dominated you becomes quieter. The fear that once felt absolute becomes optional. The doubt that once felt like truth becomes just noise. And underneath all of it, something unshakable begins to rise. Not confidence built from ego, but clarity built from truth. And from that clarity, you no longer ask, "Am I enough?" You begin to realize that question was never yours to answer, because you were never lacking, only learning. And now, you are unlearning. Final truth settling in. You were never broken. You were never weak. You were only conditioned to forget your strength. And now, that memory is returning. Comment below. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. And now, as you reach the deepest layer of this realization, something inside you no longer wants to return to the old version of thinking. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you cannot unknow it. Stay with this. Because this is the point where most people hesitate. They feel the truth, but they step back into comfort. But you are not stepping back anymore. You are moving forward into awareness. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. And this time, feel the difference. It is not just a sentence anymore. It is a separation line between two lives. The life where you reacted unconsciously, and the life where you observe consciously. Let that sink in. Because observation is power. The moment you can see the thought, you are no longer fully inside it. And that changes everything. Now listen carefully. There is a deeper shift happening now. Your mind will try to return to old identity patterns. Not because they are true, but because they are familiar. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. But something in you is no longer fully agreeing with that comfort. You are beginning to question it, and questioning is the beginning of liberation. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Say it again, but slower this time, as if you are speaking directly to the part of you that still doubts, because that part is not your enemy. It is just untrained awareness, and it is learning right now. There is a moment coming, very soon, where you will notice something subtle in your daily life, a pause before reacting, a gap before fear takes over, a silence before self-doubt speaks. That gap is your new power, because in that gap, you are free. Now listen closely. Most people think transformation is loud, but real transformation is quiet. It happens in moments no one sees, in thoughts no one hears, in decisions no one notices. You are not weak, you are taught to think you are. And every time you return to that truth, you are not repeating it. You are reinforcing your new identity. Now I want you to understand something very clearly. You are not trying to become strong. You are removing everything that convinced you that you are weak. Strength is not added, it is uncovered. And beneath all conditioning, there has always been clarity. There has always been awareness. There has always been presence. But it was covered by repetition, by fear, by memory, by interpretation. Now those layers are loosening, and what remains is you. Not the version shaped by others, but the version that existed before explanation. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Now feel this truth settle deeper, because something irreversible is happening inside your perception. You are no longer fully believing every thought that enters your mind. You are beginning to witness them instead. And that is the beginning of mastery. Because mastery is not control. It is awareness without attachment. Now listen carefully. There will still be moments where the old identity tries to return. It will try to speak through memory, through comparison, through fear of judgment. But now, you will notice it sooner, and noticing is power. Because what is noticed loses authority. You are not weak, you were taught to think you are, and soon, this will not feel like a reminder anymore. It will feel like truth you live from, not something you repeat, but something you embody. And here is the final unfolding. You are no longer asking the world for validation. You are beginning to generate your own internal direction, quietly, consistently, powerfully. This is where identity truly shifts, not when you understand it, but when you act from it without hesitation. So now, as this message reaches its final breath, take this with you beyond this moment. When doubt rises, you pause. When fear speaks, you observe. When limitation appears, you question. And then you remember, you are not weak. You were taught to think you are. Final declaration, not as hope, not as wish, but as identity returning. You were never broken. You were never less. You were only conditioned. And now you are free again. Comment below. You are not weak. You were taught to think you are.